There we go. Glad to be with you. We are going to jump right in here. I'll share screen and go to our usual kind of conversation. I hope I may have moved that too soon. Do that first. There we go. All right. So last week we talked about chapter 11, which is all about the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And there's so many questions there that we all started to engage and talk about, right? You have the question about grief and what is Jesus feeling? What are each the people feeling? Why did Jesus wait and let his friend die? How do people respond to this miracle? All of these things are part of this swirl of activities. It's not simply the miracle, but a whole lot about what does it mean and how does it change things. One of the clear ways that it changes things, the raising of Lazarus leads directly to Caiaphas and the leadership, probably the Sanhedrin, but it's not completely clear. But the leadership saying it's time to kill Jesus. It was maybe okay to have a guy preaching and teaching broadly some good ideas. It's another whole thing to have someone who controls life and death itself. So for the sake of this nation, this one man must die, as says his unintentional prophecy. So with that in mind, we'll turn to chapter 12, which is a big part of that. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. And there they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." So we're 6 days before the Passover, which means we are in the middle of what you would call Holy Week in the Synoptic Gospels, right? 6 days before, really in the Synoptic Gospels, the tradition is it's pretty much exactly the week before that's the triumphal entry. So we're right coming up to it, to that moment. Passover explicitly is connected, as we'll see later in the chapter, in 18 and 19. We'll see exactly how explicitly Passover is connected to the crucifixion, but it is very much part and parcel of the whole crucifixion process in the Gospel of John. He uses it in very specific ways. The big thing that we can say is the end is near, and everyone seems to know it. Jesus certainly has known it for a while, but there even seems to be a sort of knowledge within the community, within his followers, that they're getting closer to some sort of conclusion. It's not clear exactly what. This is one of those things that is always interesting to me. People talk about sort of a sixth sense in these situations. For me, it's much the same as what happened with Martin Luther King, right? When he gave his famous mountaintop speech in Memphis right before he was killed, and people said, "Oh, he had this amazing insight into his life." Probably, but also King received daily death threats, so it wasn't like he didn't know people were after him. So there's this sort of both and, I think, situation where Jesus absolutely had a sixth sense and a knowledge and ability to know something was coming. And people were probably pretty explicitly telling him he was going to die and they were going to kill him. We've seen that a couple of times where they pick up stones and they're ready to stone him. Jesus knows it's all coming to a head, and it doesn't take another level of knowledge to see that this is happening. And I think the disciples are probably on that side of things, right? They just know things are getting worse and worse and worse, and sooner or later. So the roles of the sisters here are just like what we saw in Luke. They're the same. That is, Martha's working and preparing the meal. Mary is now with Jesus, in this case, anointing him with the oil. We have to be careful here because there's multiple stories about women washing Jesus's feet. So we have to take a minute and take that apart. They get blended. So the first is Luke 7. A sinful woman comes and washes Jesus' feet with her tears and dries them with her hair. And the Pharisees, whom Jesus is having a meal with, are horrified that this woman of ill repute would come and wash Jesus' hair. To which Jesus said, those who have been forgiven much are grateful that much more, right? So because her sins had been forgiven, which were many, she is showing in an extraordinary way that gratitude for forgiveness, right? Versus those who only a little bit forgiven tend to be less grateful. So what we can say is this is not the same. Mary is decidedly not the same as the sinful woman, but sometimes you will hear people conflate the two because the stories are similar, right? Because there is this moment of the woman drying her tears with her hair, and Mary similarly dries the perfume from Jesus's feet as well. So there's some similarities, but not quite the same. And it also shows up in both Matthew and Mark. So really all four Gospels have one version or another of this going on, right? In Matthew and Mark, a woman anoints Jesus's hair with ointment. I have Luke listed. Luke's only story is about the sinful woman who comes. But in Matthew and Mark, they're at the home of Simon the leper, whoever that is or was, and a woman comes in and anoints Jesus's hair with ointment. So she has a vial of perfume and pours it on Jesus's head, not his feet. And again, she is chastised by not just one disciple, not Judas, but all the disciples get upset and say they should have spent this money on the poor. You should have spent this on better ways than just pouring out perfume on Jesus's head or on his feet. So there we go. But in this case, John has a very different telling. That is, he shows that there's a close friend who is effectively thanking him for bringing her brother back to life and preparing him for death. And Matthew, Mark, and John, each of these are explicit. Jesus is very clear in each of these that the woman who is either anointing his head with oil or anointing his feet with oil, as in John, are preparing him for his death, his impending death. So it's a very touching moment and intimate moment. The other thing that I didn't talk about just at the very beginning, Jesus is back in town. He is back to see Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. We're not sure if a lot of time has elapsed or just a little bit of time, but he comes back a second time. And they're having a meal, a feast of some sort, and it's not clear if it's to celebrate that Lazarus is back alive or if it's to celebrate that Jesus did it, or both. There's ambiguity about why they're feasting and celebrating, but it doesn't take a whole lot of guessing to figure out why. What else do we hear? What else do we hear in this opening part of the chapter?
That passage or verse where Jesus says you'll always have the poor has always been a little bit confusing to me. I understand that she was trying to prepare for his death, but at the same time, it seems like such a huge use of resources.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, so we can say from an objective standpoint that a denarius was it was a day laborer's wage, and estimates have basically this would cost this ointment would be $15,000 to $20,000 worth of ointment. So it is a whole lot of ointment, right? I mean, very expensive. And so there is an appropriate outrage about, wait, why are we spending this and just wiping it on his feet? That's it. Not even, you would not, in the typical case, using an ointment like this, using pure nard, which is, if you're curious, it is an ointment that comes from India. So it's expensive just because of probably the distance it took to travel and to get it to Israel or to Palestine. So there is that question of like, you would ordinarily use just a drop to make things smell better, not the entire jar, in part because it cost so much, and in part because it was a very fragrant ointment. And so there is this sort of question about why is it okay to seemingly waste this on Jesus? And Jesus has this reasoning again that it's, well, only with you a little bit longer. It's for my death. I'm preparing for my death. It is a blessing to me. And I think the thing that has often been, at least for me, misunderstood is it's a way of Jesus saying, no, you don't have to worry about the poor. I don't think that's what he's saying at all here. I think he's more saying that this is something that is extraordinary because I'm about to face death, and it's an extraordinary show of love for me. Therefore, it's okay. But I don't think he is saying, oh, therefore you don't have to care about the poor, or therefore you don't have to do anything for the poor. Far from it. Certainly, that's not consonant with anything else Jesus says the rest of his ministry. But this is definitely that verse that gets used in that way sometimes, that people will talk about the poor not being well, they'll just use this verse to say like, oh, well, there are always going to be poor people, so do what you can, but you're not going to ever fix it, right? Because Jesus told us so, is how this verse gets used. But that is not the way it's understood in the context. It's no, we should care for the poor, but right now it's okay for her to care for me.
I read a book a few years ago by the evangelist Jim Wallace called God's Politics. And his take on this passage is that Jesus was speaking to people in his movement, and it was to say it was a given within the movement that the focus on the poor was essential to their ministry. So when he says you'll always have the poor with you, was in this, because that's what we're all about. You're always going to be working to help the poor, and that's how he.
Mm-hmm.
That was his explanation, that this was not Jesus dissing the poor.
Right.
I mean, to me, what this is another instance of Jesus saying, what counts is focusing on your relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, there's sort of echoes of the Mary and Martha passage, but she has the opportunity to be with her Lord and to love her Lord, and this is this cultivation of the relationship with God is what we should be about.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right on. I think, part of this too, that often happens with this discussion, the sort of modern reflection of this, that you'll hear a lot of times, is people will say, why are you spending so much on the church building when there's so many poor, right? Like, that's the sort of modern conversation that will happen. Would Jesus really want a giant church in his name while there are poor people outside her doors? Or the gilded ceiling, or the whatever statue that's extra fancy and nice, or the beautiful painting and that kind of thing. And this is, again, that sound of verse that people will say, well, being connected to Jesus or honoring Jesus is important because of this verse, right? Which, again, I'm not always sure that that's necessarily the reasoning that Jesus is using, right? It's she is in direct relationship with Jesus, not sort of things honoring him around him. But these are those things that we have to question a lot about with the church. Like how much sense does it make to have the perfect, beautiful church building, and how much sense does it make to say, well, maybe we should be spending more on those outside our walls than those within. And there's no answer to that. These are those hard questions that the text forces us to engage, but does not give us an answer to. I would argue, because again, Jesus, I can't remember which of my professors said it. I think it was Dr. Kate Sonderegger, but Jesus was not a systematic theologian. He did not give us the perfect sort of dogmatic answers to every single question. He told us stories instead, right? So he would talk about caring for the poor and the importance of caring for the poor. And then this moment happens and you go, well, which is it? Or how do these things in tension play out with each other? Help us understand the way this is all supposed to work together. And we don't get that. A systematic theologian would literally go through and tell you, well, this happens up to here, and then this happens up to here, and these are the tensions, and this is how you answer it. That's much more of how systematic theology works. Jesus didn't teach that way. He just gave us, well, here's one answer, here's another answer, here's another answer, and we end up having to fill in between different teaching points what we think is the best and what Jesus would want us to do. But it's then how, the Baptist church can answer one way, the Episcopal church can answer another way, and the Catholics can answer yet another way, right? I mean, we end up with very different answers a lot of times.
I mean, I think there's a lot of mysticism in his approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, just as much as, we get to it later, but the dialogue with Pilate, when he says, my followers are not from they're not from this world. I mean, it's just where,
right.
The mundane stuff is not what I'm about. What I'm about is relationship with God.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Anything else from these opening verses? All right. So we just have a few verses here, and then we stop again. The next sort of section. When the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death as well, since it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and were believing in Jesus. So this is a quick pause. Lazarus is now all connected with Jesus, right? He's to die because he is proof of a miracle. And so Jesus's fate and Lazarus's fate are now pretty intimately connected from this moment on. I don't recall there actually being any moment where they say, and then Jesus died. I mean, Lazarus died too on Good Friday or anything like that, but there's definitely an implication here that as the plot unfolds on Good Friday, that Lazarus most likely was also killed at that point as well. We don't have any real knowledge there, I don't think, but it is definitely, this idea is put out there. A lot of scholars, a lot of theologians will see this as a connection with all believers. If Lazarus is proof of a miracle and a reason to believe, then we as believers, we as people who are faithful and proof that there are people who love Jesus and believe in him, we have a similar fate as Lazarus, right? We have to be prepared in the same way. We're connected to Jesus, and we know what's going to happen to Jesus, then we also know what happens to us. That is persecution, that is ultimately on some level death. That would certainly be a comfort in the first century for most of the Christians that were hiding out in caves and running away. Even for a lot of Christians today around the world, they understand this to be completely true, right? That Lazarus would be absolutely speak to where their life is. If you are a Christian in Pakistan, then you are undoubtedly courting death in many ways to be a follower of Jesus in those situations. Because to convert other people or to talk about Jesus is, in that culture, one that can be punishable by execution. So these are those things that are all caught up together. But it is interesting. This is the part, everybody knows the story of Lazarus, but few people realize that Lazarus becomes so intimately connected with Jesus's fate as well. Any thoughts about that? The next part's much longer, but this is a sort of side note that actually is a pretty powerful notation within all of this.
I didn't realize that everybody was out to get Lazarus. That's news to me, huh?
I didn't know that either.
Yeah. They either wanted to see him as proof or they wanted to get rid of him because he was proof. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
There's a footnote in my Bible that notes that the crowds had come because of the signs that
Mhm.
Jesus has done. You know, they haven't necessarily come because of the message,
Right.
which kind of echoes the the feeding of 5,000. You know, the comment that you came because you're back because your stomachs were filled. You know, it's
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
Yeah.
so that still people aren't fully getting it.
They're not getting it at all. They're excited with the idea, but it's more of a consumer model, right? Like, well, if you did this for Lazarus, can you come do it for my cousin, brother, sister, mom, whoever, right? It's not I believe in Jesus or the pathway to life that he offers as much as the commodity of
Right.
trolling things or fixing things. He's the, what's that? Which theologian? Miroslav Volf famously said, like, God is not Santa. Like, you don't get to just come and say, I've been good. I would like this, this, and this now. It's not a transactional Christ. It's a good note, though. I like it. Yeah. All right. Well, so pushing on, the next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. To be clear, the great crowd is almost an understatement. Most estimates say that in those days, to go to the temple for Passover was pretty much a requirement for all faithful Jews that were able to get there. And estimates range that Jerusalem would swell by 150 to 250,000 people, and which is quite a number when you think about the ancient world, that you would have that many people gathered in one place for the festival itself. So great crowd, I don't know, in my mind is like, oh, there were a couple thousand or 5,000, but we're talking literally hundreds of thousands of people had pressed into Jerusalem to be part of the festival. And so some percentage of that group, in verse 13, so they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. And Jesus found a young donkey and rode on it, as it is written, do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, they remembered that these things had been written of him and had been done to him. So the crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify. It was also because they heard that he had performed this sign that the crowd went to meet him. The Pharisees then said to one another, you see, you can do nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. All right, so this is one of those classic moments. We have certain images of the triumphal entry that Palm Sunday in our head. John tells the story very differently. In fact, each of the four Gospels tell it differently. They have different themes, different ideas. Jesus is very clearly proclaimed as king in the scriptural references here. The people don't say it, but the references that he makes, the gospel writer makes, are all about Jesus as king, which are an important difference, right? The crowd is not necessarily the one saying it as much as the author is. In the other gospels, it's very much the crowd who says Hosanna, and they say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And they also say, our king is come, the Prince of Peace. There's a number of other things that happen. The palms are only mentioned once. They wave some palms, but it's not really. In the other gospels, they'll talk about palms and tunics are laid on the ground in front of Jesus to pave his way. In this case, you have more of an idea of just their waving palms near Jesus, sort of honoring him, but not in the same enacted parables that you would see in Luke and Mark and Matthew. The other real key is the crowds don't come because they've been following Jesus the whole time. They come to meet Jesus because he raised Lazarus from the dead. This is sort of the same thing Lynn was just saying, right? They came to Bethany to find him because of this wonderful sign. But in the same way, everybody came rushing out of town, out of Jerusalem, or a large group of folks, to say, like, hey, the famous guy's here. He controls life and death. Did you hear about this Jesus guy? Let's go see him. And you have a better idea in this one because in the gospel, let's say, of Matthew, it seems to be just Jesus and his disciples. Those are the only parts of the triumphal entry. There's not the whole crowd is coming to welcome him. It's sort of just a group of people who are close to Jesus sort of enacts this. On this one, you have much more of the image that you might see in your head, where the whole town has come to yell and cheer for Jesus, even if they don't know exactly what they're yelling and cheering for. Other than the rumor and the miracle that might have happened. So while the Gospels seem to say it's a small, like I said, while the other Gospels seem to say it's a small band of followers, everyone in this one wants to meet Jesus. Which would probably be true. If someone just raised someone from the dead, I imagine it doesn't matter what city you went to, there would be a triumphal entry for that person who is raising people from the dead, right? So again, John has this very, very clear idea that something exceptional is happening, but it's all because of his miracle with Lazarus, right? The miracle with Lazarus prompted people to want to kill him, and now that same miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead is prompting this very big response that the Pharisees are getting frustrated with and say, look, everybody's going out to follow Jesus now. They're all leaving the appointed feast of Passover and the things they're supposed to be doing to prepare for the Passover, and they're out celebrating this Jesus guy. The whole world has gone after him, which they see as losing their market share of religion, I guess, or things are changing and they're not happy about it. So again, here's the real interesting thing, though. Why do people believe? Because of other people's testimony. Jesus doesn't tell anybody about it. He doesn't really say anything in this. It's because the explicit reason people believe is because there's a group of folks, they believe the testimony about what Jesus has been doing. Not necessarily, they didn't get to see Lazarus raised, but they heard the good news from others, and they believe because of it. Which becomes, of course, the pattern for how our faith will grow and continue to grow and transform itself over the centuries, is not through seeing Jesus or his miracles, but for other people to tell the story of how Jesus has changed their life or changed lives around them. What else do we hear in this triumphal entry that's new, different, or sounds the same? It could be the same too. All right, but we'll keep going. So now among those who were up to worship at the festival were some Greeks. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, that is the Greek side of Galilee, and said to him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip went and told Andrew. Then Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life will lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me. Where I am, there will be my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor. All right. So John, again, makes a pretty profound change. While the Synoptic Gospels all tell the same story, If you remember in those Gospels, Jesus enters on the colt and then almost goes immediately to the temple and overturns the money changers, right? That's the big sort of sequence of events that we're used to hearing from those other three Gospels. There's this idea that Jesus is very consumed. They even use the passage, right? That his zeal for his house will consume him. Jesus is very concerned with the temple and its actions and what's going on in the world. In short, you could say Jesus is very concerned with Judaism. John has Jesus engaging with the Greeks, the larger non-Jewish world or outside communities in the diaspora. So it's not exactly clear at all times. Greek was the true language of the realm. This is one of those things people don't understand about the ancient world. While Rome conquered everything around the Mediterranean, good old Alexander the Great, about 200 years before that, had created a nation that was all Greek speaking. And Greek was the true lingua franca, that is the common language of most of the eastern part of the empire, all the area that Alexander the Great controlled. It was the language, for the most part, of Egypt, of Palestine, of most of what you would call Iran and Iraq, all that whole area that had been conquered by Alexander. When he died, his generals took over those different areas, and they all spoke Greek. And so to say that the Greeks were there is not necessarily what we think of today as just sort of Macedonia and Greece, that area. But to say anyone who spoke Greek, which is this sort of larger section of the world, those that were outside perhaps of the Jewish identity, but even in some cases, they would refer to Greek-speaking Jews, that is, Jews who do not know Hebrew but could speak Greek. So there's this idea of the diaspora, people who had left Israel to go do other things in the world as families and then only came back for the festivals. So it's not completely clear who we're talking about here, if it's non-Jews or Greek-speaking Jews, or perhaps both. But it is to say that Jesus is not concerned with the inner workings of the Jewish community in the same way, right? Like in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he immediately goes to the temple, overturns the money changers, and is very concerned about right worship. In this case, Jesus is talking to people that are explicitly outside of that inner community of Pharisees, Sadducees, and priests. So the world comes to him at the least, but he chooses to be the Son of Man. He does not choose to really talk to them in a way that says, oh, I'm only the Messiah of Jews, or I'm only the Messiah of Greeks, right? It's much similar to say, I am someone who is for all. I am the Son of Man, or the Messiah of all versus one group or the other. And how do we get to eternal life? What does Jesus say? It's through serving. And the Greek word is diakono, or diakoneo, or diakonos, which is to deacon. That's where the word deacon comes from in the church, is one who serves. But in this regard, really what we're supposed to hear from Jesus say very clearly is, if you want to follow me, if you want to be part of this life, then the way to do that is to be a servant, is to serve, is to be a deacon in your own right. What else do we hear in this passage?
I have a little confusion.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about the Greek and the Hebrew, and yet I read in many places that they spoke Armenian. So it looks like to me we got four languages going on here: Latin of the Romans,
Mm-hmm.
Hebrew of the Jews, Greek of the Greeks, and whatever Armenian is.
So it wouldn't be Armenian, it's Aramaic.
Aramaic, okay.
Aramaic was a local language. It'd be sort of, it's sort of like, in a lot of ways, you can probably say it's analogous to being Dutch. They're surrounded by all these other bigger countries, and so they speak the language of all the other countries, right? So you would have most Dutch speak 4 or 5 languages because they're just surrounded by all these bigger countries, right? They speak English, they speak French speak German.
Yeah.
Local language is Dutch, but they're pretty much the only people in the world who speak Dutch, right? No one outside of that area. Aramaic was the same kind of thing. It was a Semitic language. It's based on Hebrew and connected to it in a lot of ways. But it disappeared not too long after that, or largely disappeared not long after this era. It was subsumed by the other languages. But you have 4 or 5 languages spoken most of that region, because then and now Israel is in a crossroads, right? It's a place where there are lots of people all around them speaking different languages and engaging different things. But,
so when they're talking here in the Bible and on these different things, and I know we basically pull a lot of our language from the ancient Greek testaments, because you've told me about how the word usage has changed since it was originally written in Greek.
Sure.
I just wonder, in some of these things we're trying to figure out what's what, how much more difference could there be in meaning for some of these passages that seem to confuse us?
Yeah, I think so. The basic answer, my Greek professor in seminary was super clear on was, and I think it's fair to say, by and large, when you were reading a translation from Koine Greek, which is what the New Testament's written in, to English, you are reading. It's like watching a black and white TV show. All the major stuff is there. All the major information is present. Learning the Greek is to just have to watch it in color, right? So there's some nuance and some different ideas that come through, but it's not that significantly different. We can translate pretty accurately and correctly. We can get all the major ideas are there. It's just that sometimes the nuances are not there. That is, sometimes there's a verbal, like there's a pun and you can't translate puns very well, or there's poetry. It's hard to translate poetry from one language to the other. Those are the things that tend to be of an issue. But by and large, it's not a question. Sometimes people get really anxious and worried about, like, oh, the meaning changes if they were speaking in Aramaic and then somebody wrote it down in Greek and now we're reading it in English. There's going to be a little bit of change, but it's not as significant as some people might want it to be. That to say, like, oh, well, Jesus said this and he meant this and it got all messed up in translation. That's probably not the case. Generally speaking, the language can be that's very faithfully carried over. And it doesn't, and while sometimes it's just more like Lynn said, Jesus is a mystic in these verses, and then mystics tend to be obscure and a little difficult to understand on most occasions. So that's what we're wrestling with on this more than a linguistic question, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Yeah, it does.
I think it's really interesting to think about why in editing the material that the gospel writer had to work with, he chose to bring in this small passage about the Greeks. And so the Greeks who wished to see Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And that immediately is followed by Jesus answering, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I'm confident that the gospel writer has, that was quite intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And all I've been able to think is that, it's at this point that, Jesus sees how the word is spreading, how the message is spreading. The footnotes in the the New Oxford Study Edition, say some Greeks, says visitors for Passover, most likely Greek-speaking Jews, which certainly seems reasonable, and yet on the other hand, that if that's the interpretation, to me, it sort of makes it even more difficult to understand why the gospel writer has chosen to insert this little encounter before Jesus and announcing that the hour has come.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at what the farther have we gotten to the passage about those who love their life will.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting wording that those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life.
Mm-hmm.
What Peterson says in the Message is anyone who holds on to life just as it is destroys that life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. Which to me sort of echoes the encounter with Mary that we've just read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Well, we get very clearly from that passage with Mary is she's willing to pour out and give everything to Jesus, right? Great wealth, great. And it's then juxtaposed with Judas, who basically wants it for himself, right? Who not only does he just claim that he wants it for the poor, but he tended to steal anyway. So he wanted that $20,000 in the kitty so that he could go and get himself a nice new tunic or whatever else he was going to get. There is, John writes very clearly with these sort of ideas of here's what a faithful person looks like, someone who's willing to give up on the things of this world, and here's what a non-faithful person looks like in the image of Judas, or even in the image of the Pharisees, right, that are concerned with power and authority, consumed with control, versus one who serves and is willing to empty themselves, give up of themselves.
That does the extravagance of Mary's action really does tie into Peterson's language.
Mm-hmm.
Here, that's a nice merging of the ideas.
It is. It's a lovely way of doing it. All right. We'll keep going here. Next part. Now my soul is troubled. And what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd standing there heard it and said that it was thunder. Others said an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not for mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the rulers of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die. The crowd answered him, we have heard from the law that the Messiah remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? Jesus said to them, the light is with you for a little longer. Walk while you have the light, so that the darkness may not overtake you. If you walk in the darkness, you do not know where you are going. While you have the light, believe in the light, so that you may become children of light. All right. So now Jesus starts getting into some of our least favorite language, discourse. We're getting into that zone of he's starting to teach, and it gets in that mystic, a little bit confusing kind of phrasing. The meaning is clear on this side of the resurrection, but obviously you can see how the people gathered really don't have any idea of what Jesus is talking about. Giving up yourself, dying, being lifted up, being raised up, your time of glory, all these kinds of terms that on this side of the resurrection and knowing the story, we can say, oh, this is what it means. And it's pretty clear. But if you're just hearing this for the first time and before any crucifixion or resurrection, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You can understand that. I can be sympathetic when they're asking that. What's clear, though, is his goal is to bring the world to him through his death and resurrection. What's unclear is the world's response, right? Like, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, but it's not clear exactly how people will respond. Of particular interest, to go back here real quick, this is most scholars understand this to be a pretty clear rejection of the agony in the garden, as Luke would describe it, right? Where basically you have that moment, take this cup away from me, all that kind of stuff. This is very clear. Jesus is the exact opposite in the Gospel of John. He's like, what would I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, this is the whole reason I came. Why would I? No, this is not. Of course, I'm going to be here to be crucified. Like, that's the whole point of this process. And you have this idea much more of Jesus is completely in control. He knows God's will intimately, and he doesn't have to wrestle with it at all. There is no moment in the garden in the Gospel of John or in Gethsemane where he is anxious or worried or unsure of what comes next. It's much more this idea, this is why I came, this is my ministry, and this is what I'm going to do. Glorify your name, Father. Let's make this all work the way it's supposed to. Which is, again, a very, very different model than these anxiety and angst moments that we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but especially in Luke. What else do we hear in those verses?
I almost hear this as a continuation of where we were before. Jesus is almost walking in, almost as a returning general. He's got all these crowds gathered around him. I've got to imagine the Pharisees are back there thinking, if this is the Messiah, are we leading rebellion against Rome? What kind of crazy stuff is going on here? And then the crowd seems to have that same idea of, so the Messiah is going to come and we're going to, kick out the Romans and we're going to be, the happy Jewish kingdom forever. And then Jesus seems to be addressing that exact point of that's not what I came here to do. I came here to do something very different than what you expected. Yeah, absolutely. There's very much that idea of what do humans expect versus what does God expect, and what is God's, sometimes you hear it called God's economy, right? Like, what's God's economy versus the human economy, and they're very, very different.
The footnotes in the study edition I'm reading draw a contrast with Mark where he said, this is Mark 14:34 through 36, and he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. And then you contrast that with verses 27 and 28. Now my soul is troubled, and what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Mm-hmm. It's, as you point out, I think one can assume that the gospel writer has read Mark. He's familiar with that passage, and he intends to draw a contrast.
Mm-hmm. It's right there at the surface for sure.
those two different emotions seem very human to me. To at one breath, be know that you have a tough thing to do in front of you, and be confident in doing it, and then later feel the anxiety of knowing that you still have this tough thing in front of you. That's certainly something I've experienced in life.
Amen. Amen, brother. Yeah. So there's just a little bit left here, but after Jesus had said this, he departed and hid from them. Although he performed so many signs in their presence, they did not believe in him. This was to fulfill the words spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And so they could not believe, because Isaiah also said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, so they might not look with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn. Isaiah, sorry, I did the English there, the British pronunciation. Isaiah said this because he saw his glory and spoke about him. Nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. They loved human glory more than the glory that comes. So again, this is about belief and about how humans will believe or not believe. And it's assumed that folks, there's going to be both, right? There's very clearly people who believe, but they can't say anything about it. And there are also who are too afraid to name it. There are people who, actually, I guess there's three groups, really, right? There's the full-on believers who aren't afraid to stand with Jesus all the way to the end. There are those who believe but are afraid of what might happen, what might be the repercussions of being kicked out of the synagogue. And then there are people who absolutely don't believe, right? So you have these three groups that are pretty much assumed, if not outright stated in these verses. And the underlying concern is pretty much, how is God dealing with this unbelief? What does God do with it? And what we see is, going all the way back to Isaiah, God's not surprised. God's not surprised at all that people don't believe, or they believe but not enough to do something about it. And basically what we hear in these verses is God works around them all the time to achieve God's goal, right? There are people that he can work with completely, he'll work with partially, and those that he has to work against. And in all cases, God's will is not going to be thwarted in that process. In fact, there is this very clear indication that God is even using those who don't believe pretty explicitly, as much as he is those who do believe. That is, he knows they'll respond with anger and hatred, and that will achieve God's ultimate goal of both crucifixion and resurrection, right? Like, this is all wrapped up in here together in a way that is not stated clearly at all, but it is part of what is being said, right? It's part of this underlying conversation of what's happening. It doesn't seem like we have a lot of choice, though, whether we believe or not, but we do have this choice to follow the light, to follow Jesus, or to not follow Jesus, which is the choice that's constantly in this gospel being put in front of us. What else do we hear in those verses? I'll read the rest just because this is the last. There's about 8 verses left in the chapter. So I'll read these real quick, and then if we have anything to say about any of it, we'll just conclude with that. Jesus cried aloud, "Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. I have come as light into the world, so that everyone who believes in me should not remain in the darkness. I do not judge anyone who hears my words and does not keep them. For I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my word has a judge. On the last day, the word that I have spoken will serve as judge. For I have not spoken on my own, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment about what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. I speak, therefore, I speak just as the Father. That's the end of the chapter. Thoughts on any of this? It's all pretty heavy stuff. Jesus is definitely challenging the crowd, challenging those gathered to think on what they believe and what they want to do. All right. Well, hey, next time is chapter 13. That's the Last Supper. So it's obviously very different from the Synoptic Gospels. In all the other works, you have the triumphal entry, and then you have a whole week of Jesus teaching in the temple, giving prophecies, telling stories, parables, all sorts of things. Not in the Gospel of John. You go pretty much directly from the triumphal entry into the Last Supper. And so it's a different way of telling this story. The last week is sort of a day and a half in the Gospel of John. So we'll look at that and talk about all that, and may have plenty of questions about this last part of the chapter too. Anybody have any?
No. I just had a general question. I tried to use the link to sign up for the service on Sunday evening.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave me a pop-up. It said, that it said, see you there. But am I supposed to get a confirming email or anything?
Did you fill everything out? And it?
Yes, I put my name and email address in it.
Okay.
So I got a response on the web page, but nothing to confirm it by email.
I'll double check.
I was just curious if it's supposed to give us one.
I don't think it is, but I'll double
Okay.
with Jess. I think you're probably registered and good to go.
So it would tell you though if the space was already full, it would say, sorry, no more. Okay. So I must have got one. And then I also heard that the bishop had expanded things so that you could have more now and reserve communion and when I said more people and for a longer service too. So I don't know the details of that.
Sure. So the bishop did not add, it's not more people, but it's more time.
Time, that's what it was, time.
A longer service.
Service,
but
yes.
It's still limited to 50.
50, okay.
And then we can do bread only communion.
Right.
Taken from the reserve, but it's a very, there's a host of rules around that we're working on figuring out that are, you have to bless communion like on Wednesday and then package it in individual packages. And then when we hand it out, we have to use tongs so that there's no one who touches it and all this kinds of other rules. So we're working through, Buddy and I are working through the best process for how to do that part of it. But we're hopeful to get that all figured out this weekend, hopefully.
All right.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
It is good. We're glad to be at this point, to have some degree of opening.
All right.
Friends, anything else? As always, it's good to be with you.
Good to see you guys.
Take care, Goat.
Bye, Karen.
Peace.
Thanks,
Good to see you. Bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.